Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this little reading. So, we are going to educate ourselves or re educate ourselves on some galactic themes and some things about culture. Because this Book of the Mystery, Cosmic History Chronicles, Volume 3, is very relevant, especially now. And this book, it was published back in 2007. I believe they probably began making it around 2005. So let's dive right into this. And today we are going to look at the chapter called Cybersphere and Identity Crisis. So it starts out with some quotes. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. Albert Einstein. The more the databanks record about each one of us, the less we exist. Marshall McLuhan. And we begin. If rock and roll is the sound texture of the electronic ocean of the final stage of history, the technosphere, then the cybersphere is its cultural medium. What is the cybersphere and how does it reflect the impact of the human on the machine, and the human on the earth, and of the machine on the human? What does this have to do with the expressive modalities of the human being? The cybersphere is the sphere of influence of computer communication technologies. To begin this exploration of the cybersphere and the effect of the machine on the human psyche, three factors must be considered. 1. Increase of population. That expands globally, becoming exponential over the last 200 years. 2. Increase of technology. In brackets, that becomes exponential in its rate of innovation, propagation, and multiplication. And 3. Loss and or search for identity. In brackets, the consequent effect of factors 1 and 2 causing the human to enter a prolonged identity crisis. End bracket. With these three factors in mind, let us travel back to 1840 to view planet Earth. At this time, the human population had just reached 1 billion, a 100% increase of 500 million in 90 years. This showed that the exponential curve had begun around 1750 with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Here we see the uprooting of people from agriculture and the introduction of mechanical means for farming. For example, manual farm tools, such as sickles, were replaced by mechanical contrivances for harvesting, forcing peasants into urban areas to become factory workers. There was a struggle to find a new identity in urban centers after having lived and worked in rural areas for so long. This was the first stage of the loss of identity. The traditional way was gone. Alienation set in, and urban problems entered with violence and crime. Drug abuse and alcoholism grew to relieve the tension of laboring at the factory. In the 1840s, Morse code was invented, along with the telegraph and the camera. The camera, which is now taken for granted, was the first major mechanical artistic medium. In its formative decades, photography was extremely slow. People who wanted their portraits taken had to sit in front of the camera for at least 30 minutes while their image was slowly burned into a plate. Photographers would often place a stick behind the subject being photographed to hold their head still. Photography had a great impact on the artistic scene. With the introduction of the camera, the visual arts were slowly driven out of the traditional cultural heavens. Increasingly, the artists no longer received aristocratic patronage, and so had to move toward commercial venues, like art galleries, theaters, etc. At the same time, photography had become an increasingly appealing and popular medium, particularly with the accelerating production and distribution of newspapers, magazines, journals, and reviews. This was the beginning of popular mass media. At this point, illustrations had relied on lithography, an inexpensive but artistic craft medium that made numerous visual reproductions. As photography gained popularity, high art moved into more experimental and esoteric forms. As the population grew, the number of people that proportionally could fit into an art gallery diminished. This shifted the value of art toward a more elitist trend, lending to the increasing exploitation of new art forms. With photography, for the first time, an image could be duplicated into the likeness of a person or any other object. As a result, the artist's urge to paint in a realistic manner lessened, giving way to more experimental art forms. As a consequence, many painters changed their style into new subjective modes and expressions. By the 19th century, the machine was the principal instrument for mechanical self-replication, and would soon become the modus operandi of the entire society. I guess modus operandi sounds like the mode of operation. So, by the 20th century, the human had fully taken on the role of biological accomplice to the machine. As the machine propagates and replicates faster and faster, so also does the human need to propagate ever more rapidly to keep up with the machine, while inventing ever faster machines. This is the story of modern life. Communist Manifesto. With the rise of the machine came the rise of capitalism. In the capitalist system, the means of production is in the hands of a few entrepreneurs intent on amassing wealth and then distributing it to workers through salaries and payrolls. However, there was a great discrepancy between what the workers were paid and what the entrepreneurs paid themselves. Never had such profits been amassed. Technological networks spawned by the machine facilitated the rise of a new type of elitist power class that rapidly changed the face of society. In response to the rise of capitalism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels produced the Communist Manifesto in 1848, proclaiming that the means of production should be put in the hands of the worker. This Communist Manifesto ignited the socialist, communist, and anarchist movements and in defiance of capitalism and the whole system in general. In the 19th century, the Luddites emerged, a counterpart movement that rejected the machine altogether and opposed any type of technological propagation, any type of technological progress. A Luddite tendency is still present today. With the Industrial Revolution, society became increasingly mechanized, and the means of production as well as the artistic means became inevitably involved in processes of mass replication. For example, famous paintings can now be replicated through photographs and turned into posters, postcards, and t-shirts, and then sold for profit. This caused the mass recognition of the painting to increase its monetary value inordinately, while providing cheap replicas that could be hung on anyone's wall. Canned personalities. End quote. It's the movies that have really been running things in America ever since they were invented. They show you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, how to feel about it, and how to look about how you feel about it. Andy Warhol. As society becomes more involved in the process of mechanical self-replication, there occurs an increase in the loss of authentic self. Of course, there have always been artists and poets calling for a return of the authentic self, but these types of people become marginalized in an increasingly mechanized society. Poets such as Arthur Rimbaud in the 1870s, along with symbolist artists in the 1880s up to the 20th century surrealists, and other writers and thinkers like the beatniks, sought the means to retrieve the deeper meaning or authentic self. However, these artists were in the minority in the central fabric of life. When people follow and immerse themselves in the machine, before they know it, they start to become carbon copies, self-replicating types of carbon copies, in order to simulate or feign what they do not have. People who grow up in industrialized societies attended public educational institutions that focus primarily on preparing them for vocational means. At these educational institutions, little or no emphasis is placed on the development of consciousness or the cultivation of the personality. Rather, young people learn by example to adopt inauthentic carbon copy selves. They simulate images that they see in this mass media. Most people have just a few primary images that they base their entire persona and behavior around, many of which are pop icons. For the common person, the pressures of life cause them to lapse into a mediocre version of what they thought their parents were, and the very notion of authentic self becomes ever more remote. But without authentic self-realization, what is real? The issue of identity was exacerbated in the 20th century with the introduction of television. In the early 1950s, television became the main mechanically reproduced electronic instrument in the domestic environment, feeding people images of who they were and were not supposed to be, images of good and bad behavior, images of right and wrong, not to mention endless filler images and slogans of marketing and advertising. Television, unlike any other medium, it gave people instant images and icons that they could view in the privacy of their own homes. The first television program was aired prior to World War II, but when war broke out, all of the broadcasting systems were disrupted and suspended. Television broadcasting resumed shortly after World War II, but it was not until the 1950s that it became the dominant tool of mass media. In 1935, German Marxist Walter Benjamin wrote, "Even the technical media are relentlessly forced into uniformity. Television aims at a synthesis of radio and film and is held up only because the interested parties have not yet reached agreement. But its consequences will be quite enormous and promise to intensify the impoverishment of aesthetic manner so drastically that by tomorrow the thinly veiled identity of all industrial cultural products can come triumphantly out into the open. Derisively fulfilling the Wagnerian dream of the Gesamt Kunstwerk of the fusion of all the arts in one." Wow, sorry I was awful at pronouncing those words, but maybe I can try to read that again. Right. Even the technical media are relentlessly forced into uniformity. Television aims at a synthesis of radio and film and is held up only because the interested parties have not yet reached agreement. But its consequence will be quite enormous and promise to intensify the impoverishment of aesthetic manner so drastically that by tomorrow the thinly veiled identity of all industrial cultural products can come triumphantly out into the open, derisively fulfilling the Wagnerian dream of the Gesamt Kunstwerk of the fusion of all the arts in one work. It's quite the quote. So showing us that even all of the media has come into uniformity through the television. So let's continue. This is a highly prophetic statement for 1935, in consideration that television had not yet become a mass medium. In this article, Benjamin also mentions cinema, radio, and the phonograph record as the mechanical reproduction of sound. The radio was actually the first instrument of the cybersphere. Radio was created during the 19th and 20th centuries using vacuum tubes, receivers, and tuners transmitting various types of electronic signals that magically carried the imprints of real voice and musical sounds. When radio was first broadcast, it was an awe-inspiring phenomenon, Suddenly, there was an electronic medium that projected living voices, sounds, and alternate realities right into your own airspace. A phonograph record was quite different from radio. It did not cost much money to listen to the radio, but it did cost money to buy a phonograph recorded. Wax discs that held recorded sounds. Film was more like a phonograph record, as it was produced in a studio and then marketed to outlets called movie theaters. At this time, movie theaters were grand and ornate, elaborately designed to resemble French castles or Arabic palaces. In the 1920s and 1930s, going in the movies was a major cultural event. People would get dressed up to attend this new artistic phenomenon. Nothing like this had ever existed. However, some critics argued that movies had a detrimental effect on traditional arts, such as music and painting. Other critics felt that movies denied the human the possibility of thinking by reducing viewers to passive voyeurs, sitting in darkened spaces while fictitious projections rapidly flashed on a screen. Compared with film, theater was a living art form that unfolds on stage at the rate of life itself. With theater, live performers are seen and heard in real time. On the other hand, the possibilities of film as an art form and tool for communication are vast. For example, film can speed scenes up or slow scenes down. It can magnify details to focus on certain themes. Something live theater could never do. In filmmaking, the camera can be used to manipulate images in various ways to communicate specific ideas or themes. The power of film as an art form is enormous, depending on the consciousness and skill of the producers and directors. The earlier black and white movies often appeared more artistically effective than most modern-day commercialized films. The quality of films such as Citizen Kane, The Third Man, or Metropolis used black and white to create plainly painterly effects that greatly enhance the psychological intent and the message of the film. In the film, the actor becomes the star. It is different to be a theater actor performing live before an audience than a film star performing before a mechanical camera. The film actor gets packaged and marketed as a star, and people go to the movies just to see the star rather than the movie. For example, many people would rush to the theater to see movies starring Marilyn Monroe. The content of the movie did not matter. They were going to watch the star. Hollywood developed the star system, spawning a host of popular magazines and tabloids that amplify every mannerism of the stars, always looking for the most sensational part of their behavior to exploit. Take a quick drink for a moment. Next paragraph, chapter. Human infatuated by machine. We are painting a picture of the effect of industrial technology on the human being. The effect of technology to replicate artistic means is an increasingly mechanistic way. By the 20th century, the psyche of society was largely shaped by photography, radio, and phonograph, and film. These are the mediums taken for granted today, but when they first appeared, they created a powerful new shift in the nature of culture. At the same time, traditional arts were increasingly splintered and entered into esoteric realms, leading into more experimental modes of consciousness. The myth of the machine and progress is that the machine will give the human a better, easier, and more comfortable life. However, this is purely materialistic point of view. We might ask, does the human love the machine because of the effect the machine has on its consciousness? Does the human actually become more infatuated and absorbed with the machine because the machine gives the illusion of a sense of power, authority, and control over nature? In this way, the psyche of the human becomes the psyche of the machine. The machine and machine society alienate the human from nature. The human now operates in huge artificial environments. Modern urban centers with occasional parks, subway trains, shopping malls, and grocery stores filled with artificial lights. Even when the human takes a walk in nature, iPods and cell phones are glued to their ears, while at home television and internet fills the senses. By the day, by day, the human often works a job of alienated labor, usually spending hours working on a machine under fluorescent lights. The point is that removal from nature and excuse me. The point is that removal from nature increasingly predisposes the human to further identify with the machine, to become infatuated with the machine, thinking that every new technological innovation increases his or her intrinsic power over nature. This is the cumulative process in an age of rapid increase in technology. The social effects also extend to the so-called cultural industries, beginning with television and the invention of the computer in the 1950s. In all of the cultural industries, most notably film and music, entrepreneurs manage artists who are feeding the masses with phonography records, films, or television shows. In this type of artificial environment, filled with canned entertainment, prepackaged and pre-recorded, virtual reality becomes more fascinating to the human than nature. This sets the foundation for our present stage, where the human is continuously and sometimes frantically searching for his or her true identity. This problem of identity becomes more acute at the final stages of the 20th century and the closing of the cycle. After the Second World War, underground movements arose, such as the existentialists, beboppers, beatniks, hippies, and punks. These movements usually consisted of marginalized people who rejected and who were rejected by society, often in favor of seeking a deeper meaning to the riddle of life and the self. In this search, members of these counterculture groups often mocked or derided mainstream societies for its plastic, inauthentic value system. Next, securing identity. As we mentioned earlier, there were 1 billion humans in 1840, and in just over 150 years, in 1995, there were 6 billion humans. The increase of population and technology in the 1840s appears primitive compared to with 1995. By 1995, there is an exponential increase of population and in speed of technology, along with a huge rise in consumer society. This was the result of the proliferation of technology, the mass speed of the process of globalization, and replication and mass control of images to influence markets. In modern society, the human is converted into a consumer, one whose life and values are determined by his or her ability to purchase and consume cheap and meaningless goods and commodities. As a result, a mass human crisis ensued. In the struggle for an identity in a mechanistic consumer society, the final refuge is the exploitation of the ego. For example, the rise of the rave parties as a cultural form in the 1990s was one form of response to this. The world of rock and roll was sorry, didn't want to sneeze. For example, the rise of the rave parties as a cultural form in the 1990s was one form of response to this. The world of rock and roll was rejected because of the idolatry of the rock and roll star. At rave parties, people could come together, be who they wanted, according to the image they choose to project, and everyone would accept them. At this point, The idolatry of the rock and roll star was replaced with the idolatry of the self. Everyone could become his or her own idol, and if you accepted everyone else's idolatry, then you would not reject yours. This represents the emphasis of the democratization and the triumph of the individual ego to the utmost. This mentality had a major effect during the last 2 decades of the closing of the cycle. During these final decades, global society has become increasingly obsessed with problems of identity and security. For example, there are ads everywhere regarding identity theft and the need to purchase more security systems to protect particular interests and ensure that your identity is not stolen. These ads are seen everywhere in advertising, billboards, on the streets, mail advertisements, newspapers, magazines, and all over the internet. Their net effect is to arouse more fear and insecurity. Once again, let me just emphasize how this book was published in 2007 and how relevant it is today. The issue of security comes from two areas: mass media and computerized society. The possibility of hackers stealing credit card numbers creates the sense of needing to preserve identity and to set up systems of control that are increasingly complicated and more expensive. Even the telephone has become increasingly complicated with electronic, robotic operators where you must answer each question by a machine or else fail to complete your business. With automated telephone systems, the user has a little chance of personalized questions. The perceived threat of terrorism also gives rise to ever-tightening security measures, including the increase of police and military security at all checkpoints between national borders to a degree of unprecedented in all of history. People are made to wear identity badges and present their identities everywhere. It seems the world has become obsessed with identity and the protection thereof. As a consequence, everybody is burdened with various identity numbers, social security numbers, job employment numbers, credit card numbers, etc. But who are you, really? And what is your true identity? The issue of identity theft, and security is a smokescreen, as people do not even know who they really are. Not only do people not know who they really are, many do not even realize that discovering who they really are is an option. They are deprived from searching for the fundamental cause of the natural formations of their being. This creates a hallucinatory world at the closing of the cycle, a world that has become its own science fiction hallucination, and everyday life management revolves around identity, securing and proving that you are and you are not that you are you and you are not someone else. Viewed from a sociological/psychological perspective, the entire human species as a planetary organism is involved in a major identity crisis. This identity crisis is exacerbated by immersion in the machine. The social injustice caused by those who control the machine and the alienated ones who seek to reject the machine or use it against those who seek to control. It is important to note that it is only in the last 25 years that the cybersphere came into existence. Proliferation of the cybersphere. The major revolutionary breakthrough was the personal computer in the 1980s. Up to that point, the computer was very large, unwieldy, and cumbersome. But by the 1980s, fiber technology was such that computers could be made small enough so that the personal computer became a must item. First, in affluent societies, third world societies were marginalized, feeding off the crumbs of the rich. However, by this time, third world countries were immersed in television, even in the slums. So the effects are filtered through to all levels of society. However, in the 1980s, with the personal computer, the possibility of the cybersphere had begun. At the same time as the introduction of the personal computer, came the fax machine that was able to transmit documents by phone to anybody in the world relatively quickly. The copy machine had also become of age in this decade, and it became possible to make mass copies of documents and graphics at a very low cost. By the 1980s, human civilization had now had the radio, television, film, fax, copy machine, satellite hookups that made available hundreds of channels of television, and the personal computer. These technological factors adversely impacted the human's capacity to search for the authentic self by simultaneously increasing anxiety and competition while stimulating the people to model themselves after brand names. All of these are components constituting and contributing to what we might call the fictitious personality of the planetary human. With the introduction of the internet in the 1990s, the cybersphere became fully into its own. The ultimate conglomerate media technology. The internet is the fusion of the personal computer, telephone, streaming video, and audio, so you have radio, television, telephone, and stereo all in one. In this way, the internet becomes the vital electronic nervous system of the human species. As technological speed and expansion increases, the cybersphere and electronic technologies impact the human mind and the senses so swiftly that there is no time for social assessment of the impact. As opposed to the heavy industrial technologies like automobiles and elevators, information technologies affect the raw data coming in through our eyes, mind, and ears. These new technologies ultimately stem from the computer, hence the cybersphere, sphere of the artificial intelligence and communication. Just going to read this little side part here. Cybersphere reaching its limits. When a system reaches its limits, this is the point when a new evolutionary state is triggered. In other words, you can look at the course of cosmic evolutionary process and see that every time there is an evolutionary jump or shift, it is precisely because the preceding stage or the system constituting the main element of the preceding stage has reached its limit. This is not difficult to understand because the organism constituting the system has limited means of expression, of information gathering, conditioned by a particular kinds of instinctual tendency. Both the mental and physical environments are bombarded daily with increased volumes both of created goods as well as information. Since the means of expression are limited and obviously after a certain time all the possibilities of expression of the limited system become exhausted. So to pretty much just sum that up, anytime you have a system, the system doesn't evolve until a critical piece of that information or critical piece of infrastructure or machinery breaks. And you can see that anywhere in life. I like the metaphor that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Anyways, sorry, tangent. Let us begin and continue. Excuse me. Actually, I think I'm going to pause it, make this part 2.